Hello, my friend. Welcome to the Sleepy Archive. I'm so glad you're here. How was your day today? Tonight, we step into the shadows of Old England. The year is 1558. Queen Elizabeth I has just come to the throne, and across the villages and market towns of England, in the cold stone cottages and the smoky taverns and the windswept churchyards, something old and frightening still lives in the minds of ordinary people. The fear of witches. Not the witches of fairy tales, but real women, and sometimes men, accused by their neighbors, dragged before judges, and tried for crimes that could send them to the gallows. Wallace Notestein, an American historian, spent years reading through the court records and pamphlets and trial transcripts of this forgotten world, and in 1911, he published what became the definitive account of witchcraft in England. Tonight, we read his words slowly, quietly, letting that strange, shadowy world rise up around us. The smell of tallow candles and damp stone, the sound of wind through a village at night, a name whispered across a fence, a curse muttered under a breath. So let your body grow still, let your breathing slow, and allow history to carry you gently into the long ago dark. Chapter 1. The First Witches, Elizabeth's England. We need not, indeed, be surprised that the state should have been remiss in punishing a crime so vague in character and so closely related to an honorable profession. Except where conjuration had affected high interests of state, it had been practically overlooked by the government. Now, and then throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, there had been isolated plots against the sovereign, in which conjury had played a conspicuous part. With these few exceptions, the crime had been one left to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. But now the state was ready to reclaim its jurisdiction over these crimes and to assume a very positive attitude of hostility towards them. This came about in a way that has already been briefly indicated. The government of the Queen found itself threatened constantly by plots for making away with the Queen, plots which their instigators hoped would overturn the Protestant regime and bring England back into the fold. Elizabeth had hardly mounted her throne when her counselors began to suspect the use of sorcery and conjuration against her life. As a result, they instituted the most painstaking inquiries into all reported cases of the sort, especially in and about London and the neighboring counties. Every Catholic was suspected. 2 cases that were taken up within the first year came to nothing, but a third trial proved more serious. In November of 1558, Sir Anthony Fortescue, member of a well-known Catholic family, was arrested, together with several accomplices, upon the charge of casting the horoscope of the Queen's life. Fortescue was soon released, but in 1561 he was again put in custody, this time with 2 brothers-in-law, Edmund and Arthur Pole, nephews of the famous cardinal of that name. The plot that came to light had many ramifications. It was proposed to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, to Edmund Pole, and from Flanders to proclaim her Queen of England. In the meantime, Elizabeth was to die a natural death, at least so the conspirators claimed, prophesied for her by 2 conjurers, John Prestall and Edmund Causin, with the assistance of a wicked sprite. It was discovered that the plot involved the French and Spanish ambassadors. Relations between Paris and London became strained. The conspirators were tried and sentenced to death. Fortescue himself, perhaps because he was a second cousin of the Queen and brother of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, seems to have escaped the gallows. The Fortescue affair was, however, but one of many conspiracies on foot during the time. Throughout the 60s and the 70s, the Queen's counselors were on the lookout. Justices of the peace and other prominent men in the counties were kept informed by the Privy Council of reported conjurers, and they were instructed to send in what evidence they could gather against them. It is remarkable that 3/4 of the cases that came under investigation were from a territory within 30 miles of London. 2/3 of them were from Essex. Not all the conjurers were charged with plotting against the Queen, but that charge was most common. It is safe to suppose that, in the cases where that accusation was not preferred, it was nevertheless the alarm of the Privy Council for the life of the Queen that had prompted the investigation and arrest. Between 1578 and 1582, critical years in the affairs of the Scottish Queen, the anxiety of the London authorities was intense. Their precautions were redoubled. Representatives of the government were sent out to search for conjurers and were paid well for their services. The Earl of Shrewsbury, a member of the council who had charge of the now captive Queen Mary, kept in his employ special detectors of conjuring. Nothing about Elizabeth's government was better organized than Cecil's detective service, and the state papers show that the ferreting out of the conjurers was by no means the least of its work. It was a service carried on, of course, as quietly as could be, and yet the cases now and again came to light and made clear to the public that the government was very fearful of conjurers' attacks upon the Queen. No doubt the activity of the council put all conjurers under public suspicion and in some degree roused public resentment against them. This brings us back to the point: what had the conjurers to do with witchcraft? By this time the answer is fairly obvious. The practicers of the magic arts, the charmers and enchanters, were responsible for developing the notions of witchcraft. The good witch brought in her company the black witch. This in itself might never have meant more than an increased activity in the church courts. But when Protestant England grew suddenly nervous for the life of the Queen, when the conjurers became a source of danger to the sovereign, and the council commenced its campaign against them, the conditions had been created in which witchcraft became at once the most dangerous and detested of crimes. While the government was busy putting down the conjurers, the aroused popular sentiment was compelling the justices of the peace and then the assize judges to hang the witches. This cannot be better illustrated than by the Abingdon affair of 1578 to 1579. Word had been carried to the Privy Council that Sir Henry Newell, Justice of the Peace, had committed some women near Abingdon on the charge of making waxen images. The government was at once alarmed and sent a message to Sir Henry and to the Dean of Windsor, instructing them to find out the facts and to discover if the plots were directed against the Queen. The precaution was unnecessary. There was no ground for believing that the designs of the women accused had included the Queen. Indeed, the evidence of guilt of any kind was very flimsy. But the excitement of the public had been stirred to the highest pitch. The Privy Council had shown its fear of the women, and all 4 of them went to the gallows. The same situation that brought about the attack upon witchcraft and conjuration was no doubt responsible for the transfer of jurisdiction over the crime. We have already seen that the practice of conjuration had probably been left largely to the episcopal hierarchy for punishment. The archdeacons were expected in their visitations to inquire into the practice of enchantment and magic within the parishes and to make report. In the reign of Elizabeth, it became no light duty. The Church set itself to suppress both the consulter and the consulted. By the largest number of recorded cases deal, of course, with the first class. It was very easy when sick or in trouble to go to a professed conjurer for help. It was like seeking a physician's service, as we have seen. The Church frowned upon it, but the danger involved in disobeying the Church was not deemed great. The cunning man or woman was of course the one who ran the great risk. When worst came to worst, and the ecclesiastical power took cognizance of his profession, The best he could do was to plead that he was a good witch and rendered valuable services to the community. But a good end was in the eyes of the church no excuse for an evil means. The good witches were dealers with evil spirits and hence to be repressed. Yet the church was very light in its punishments. In the matter of penalties, indeed, consulter and consulted fared nearly alike, and both got off easily. Public confession and penance in one or more specifically designated churches, usually in the nearest parish church, constituted the customary penalty. In a few instances, it was coupled with a requirement that the criminal should stand in the pillory, taper in hand, at several places at stated times. The ecclesiastical records are so full of church penances that a student is led to wonder how effectual they were in shaming the penitent into better conduct. It may well be guessed that most of the criminals were not sensitive souls that would suffer profoundly from the disgrace incurred. The control of matters of this kind was in the hands of the church by sufferance only. So long as the state was not greatly interested, the church was permitted to retain its jurisdiction. Doubtless the kings of England would have claimed the state's right of jurisdiction if it had become a matter of dispute. The church itself recognized the secular power in more important cases. In such cases, the archdeacon usually acted with the justice of peace in conducting the examination, as in rendering sentence. Even then, however, the penalty was as a rule ecclesiastical. But with the second half of the 16th century, there arose new conditions which resulted in the transfer of this control to the state. Henry VIII had broken with Rome and established a Church of England around the king as a center. The power of the church belonged to the king, and, if to the king, to his ministers and his judges. Hence, certain crimes that had been under the control of the church fell under the jurisdiction of the king's courts. In a more special way, the same change came about through the attack of the Privy Council upon the conjurers. What had hitherto been a comparatively insignificant offense now became a crime against the state and was so dealt with. The change, of course, was not sudden. It was not accomplished in a year, nor in a decade. It was going on throughout the first half of Elizabeth's reign. By the beginning of the 80s, the church control was disappearing. After 1585, the state had practically exclusive jurisdiction. We have now finished the attempt to trace the beginning of the definite movement against witchcraft in England. What witchcraft was, what it became, how it was to be distinguished from sorcery. These are questions that we have tried to answer very briefly. We have dealt in a cursory way with a series of cases extending from Anglo-Saxon days down to the 15th century in order to show how unfixed was the matter of jurisdiction. We have sought also to explain how continental opinion was introduced into England through Jewel and other Marian exiles, to show what independent forces were operating in England, and to exhibit the growing influence of the charmers and their relation to the development of witchcraft. And lastly, we have aimed to prove that the special danger to the Queen had no little part in creating the crusade against witches. These are conclusions of some moment, and a caution must be inserted. We have been treating of a period where facts are few and information fragmentary. Under such circumstances, conclusions can only be tentative. Perhaps the most that can be said of them is that they are suggestions. The year 1566 is hardly less interesting in the history of English witchcraft than 1563. It has been seen that the new statute passed in 1563 was the beginning of a vigorous prosecution by the state of the detested agents of the evil one. In 1566 occurred the first important trial known to us in the new period. That trial deserves note not only on its own account, but because it was recorded in the first of the long series of witch chapbooks, if we may so call them. A very large proportion of our information about the execution of the witches is derived from these crude pamphlets, briefly recounting the trials. The witch chapbook was a distinct species. In the days when the chronicles were the only newspapers, it was what is now the extra, brought out to catch the public before the sensation had lost its flavor. It was of course a partisan document, usually a vindication of the worthy judge who had condemned the guilty, with some moral and religious considerations by the respectable and righteous author. A terribly serious bit of history it was that he had to tell, and he told it grimly and without pity. Such comedy as lights up the gloomy black-letter pages was quite unintentional. He told a story, too, that was full of details trivial enough in themselves, but details that give many glimpses into the everyday life of the lower classes in town and country. The pamphlet of 1566 was brief and compact of information. It was entitled The Examination and Confession of Certain Witches at Chinsford in the county of Essex before the Queen's Majesties Judges the XXVI Day of July, Anno 1566. The trial there recorded is one that presents some of the most curious and inexplicable features in the annals of English witchcraft. The personnel of the size court is mysterious. At the first examination, Dr. Cole and Master Foscue were present. Both men are easily identified. Dr. Cole was the Reverend Thomas Cole, who had held several places in Essex, and had in 1564 been presented to the rectory of Stamford Rivers, about 10 miles from Chelmsford. Master Foscue was unquestionably Sir John Fortescue, later Chancellor of the Exchequer, and at this time Keeper of the Great Wardrobe. On the second examination, Sir Gilbert Gerard, the Queen's Attorney, and John Southcote, Justice of the Queen's Bench, were present. Why Southcote should be present is perfectly clear. It is not so easy to understand about the others. Was the Attorney General acting as presiding officer, or was he conducting the prosecution? The latter hypothesis is of course more consistent with his position. But what were the rector of Stamford Rivers and the keeper of the Great Wardrobe doing there? Had Dr. Cole been appointed in recognition of the claims of the church, and the keeper of the wardrobe, what was the part that he played? One cannot easily escape the conclusion that the case was deemed one of unusual significance. Perhaps the Privy Council had heard of something that alarmed it, and had delegated these 4 men, all known at Elizabeth's court, to examine into the matter in connection with the assizes. The examinations themselves present features of more interest to the psychologist than to the historical student, yet they have some importance in the understanding of witchcraft as a social phenomenon. Elizabeth Frances, when examined, confessed with readiness to various villainies. From her grandmother, she said she had, as a child, received a white-spotted cat named Sathon, whom she had fed, and who gave her what she asked for. She desired to have one Andrew Biles to her husband, which was a man of some wealth, and the cat Dewydee promise she shouled. But the promise proved illusory. The man left her without marriage, and then she willed Sathon to touch his body, WHYCH, he forthwith DYD, whereof he died. Once again she importuned Satan for a husband. This time she gained one, not so rich as the other. She bore a daughter to him, but the marriage was an unhappy one. They lived not so quietly as she desired, being stirred to much unquietness, and moved to swearing and cursing. Thereupon she employed the spirit to kill her child, and to lame her husband. After keeping the cat 15 years, she turned it over to Mother Waterhouse, a poor woman. Mother Waterhouse was now examined. She had received the cat, and kept it a great while in a pot. She had then turned it into a toad. She had used it to kill geese, hogs, and cattle of her neighbors. At length she had employed it to kill a neighbor whom she disliked, and finally her own husband. The woman's 18-year-old daughter, Joan, was now called to the stand and confirmed the fact that her mother kept a toad. She herself had one day been refused a piece of bread and cheese by a neighbor's child and had invoked the toad's help. The toad promised to assist her if she would surrender her soul. She did so. Then the toad haunted the neighbor's girl in the form of a dog with horns. The mother was again called to the stand and repeated the curious story told by her daughter. Now the neighbor's child, Agnes Brown, was brought in to testify. Her story tallied in some of its details with that of the two Waterhouse women. She had been haunted by the horned dog, and she added certain descriptions of its conduct that revealed good play of childish imagination. The attorney put some questions, but rather to lead on the witnesses than to entangle them. He succeeded, however, in creating a violent altercation between the Waterhouses on the one hand and Agnes Brown on the other, over trifling matters of detail. At length he offered to release Mother Waterhouse if she would make the spirit appear in the court. The offer was waived. The attorney then asked, "When dyd thy cat suck of thy blood?" "Never," said she. He commanded the jailer to lift up the kerchief on the woman's head. He did so, and the spots on her face and nose where she had pricked herself for the evil spirit were exposed. The jury retired. 2 days later, Agnes Waterhouse suffered the penalty of the law, not, however, until she had added to her confessions. The case is a baffling one. We can be quite sure that the pamphlet account is incomplete. One would like to know more about the substance of fact behind this evidence. Did the parties that were said to have been killed by witchcraft really die at the time specified? Either the facts of their deaths were well known in the community and were fitted with great cleverness into the story Mother Waterhouse told, or the jurors and the judges neglected the first principles of common sense and failed to inquire about the facts. The questions asked by the Queen's attorney reveal hardly more than an unintelligent curiosity to know the rest of the story. He shows just one saving glint of skepticism. He offered to release Mother Waterhouse if she would materialize her spirit. Mother Waterhouse was her own worst enemy. Her own testimony was the principal evidence presented against her, and yet she denied guilt on one particular upon which the Attorney General had interrogated her. This might lead one to suppose that her answers were the haphazard replies of a half-witted woman. But the supposition is by no means consistent with the very definite and clear-cut nature of her testimony. It is useless to try to unravel the tangles of the case. It is possible that under some sort of duress, although there is no evidence of this, she had deliberately concocted a story to fit those of Elizabeth Frances and Agnes Brown, and that her daughter, hearing her mother's narrative in court, a very possible thing in that day, had fitted hers into it. It is conceivable, too, that Mother Waterhouse had yielded merely to the wish to amaze her listeners. It is a more probable supposition that the questions asked of her by the judge were based upon the accusations already made by Agnes Brown, and that they suggested to her the main outlines of her narrative. Elizabeth Frances, who had been the first accused and who had accused Mother Waterhouse, escaped. Whether it was because she had turned state's evidence or because she had influential friends in the community, we do not know. It is possible that the judges recognized that her confession was unsupported by the testimony of other witnesses. Such a supposition, however, credits the court with keener discrimination than seems ever to have been exhibited in such cases in the 16th century. But, though Elizabeth Frances had escaped, her reputation as a dangerous woman in the community was fixed. 13 years later, she was again put on trial before the itinerant justices. This brings us to the second trial of witches at Chelmsford in 1579. Mistress Francis's examination elicited less than in the first trial. She had cursed a woman and bade a mischief to light upon her. The woman, she understood, was grievously pained. She followed the course that she had taken before and began to accuse others. We know very little as to the outcome. At least one of the women accused went free because manslaughter or murder was not objected against her. 3 women, however, were condemned and executed. One of them was almost certainly Elian Smith, daughter of a woman hanged as a witch, another illustration of the persistence of suspicion against the members of the family. The Chelmsford affair of 1579 was not unlike that of 1566. There were the same tales of spirits that assumed animal forms. The young son of Elian Smith declared that his mother kept 3 spirits: Great Dick in a wicker bottle, Little Dick in a leathern bottle, and Willet in a wool pack. Goodwife Webb saw a thing like a black dog go out of her door. But the general character of the testimony in the second trial bore no relation to that in the first. There was no agreement of the different witnesses. The evidence was haphazard. The witch and another woman had a falling out. Fallings out were very common. Next day, the woman was taken ill. This was the sort of unimpeachable testimony that was to be accepted for a century yet. In the affair of 1566, the judges had made some attempt at quizzing the witnesses, but in 1579, all testimony was seemingly rated at par. In both instances, the proof rested mainly upon confession. Every woman executed had made confessions of guilt. This, of course, was deemed sufficient. Nevertheless, the courts were beginning to introduce other methods of proving the accused guilty. The marks on Agnes Waterhouse had been uncovered at the request of the Attorney General, and at her execution, she had been questioned about her ability to say the Lord's Prayer and other parts of the service. Neither of these matters was emphasized, but the mention of them proves that notions were already current that were later to have great vogue. The Chelmsford cases find their greatest significance, however, not as illustrations of the use and abuse of evidence, but because they exemplify the continuity of the witch movement. That continuity finds further illustration in the fact that there was a third alarm at Chelmsford in 1589, which resulted in 3 more executions. But in this case, the women involved seem, so far as we know, to have had no connection with the earlier cases. The fate of Elizabeth Francis and that of Elian Smith are more instructive as proof of the long-standing nature of a community suspicion. Elian could not escape her mother's reputation, nor Elizabeth her own. Both these women seem to have been of low character, at any rate. Elizabeth had admitted illicit amours, and Elian may very well have been guilty on the same count. All of the women involved in the 2 trials were in circumstances of wretched poverty. Most, if not all, of them were dependent upon begging and the poor relief for support. It is easy to imagine the excitement in Essex that these trials must have produced. The accused had represented a wide territory in the county. The women had been fetched to Chelmsford from towns as far apart as Hatfield, Peveril, and Malden. It is not remarkable that 3 years later than the affair of 1579, there should have been another outbreak in the county, this time in a more aggravated form. St. Osses or St. Ossithes, to the northeast of Chelmsford, was to be the scene of the most remarkable affair of its kind in Elizabethan times. The alarm began with the formulation of charges against a woman of the community. Ursley Camp was a poor woman of doubtful reputation. She rendered miscellaneous services to her neighbors. She acted as midwife, nursed children, and added to her income by unwitching the diseased. Like other women of the sort, she was looked upon with suspicion. Hence, when she had been refused the nursing of the child of Grace Thurlow, a servant of that Mr. Darcy, who was later to try her. And when the child soon afterward fell out of its cradle and broke its neck, the mother suspected Ursley of witchcraft. Nevertheless, she did not refuse her help when she began to have a lameness in her bones. Ursley promised to unwitch her, and seemingly kept her word, for the lameness disappeared. Then it was that the nursewoman asked for the 12 pence she had been promised, and was refused. Grace pleaded that she was a poor and nadi woman. Ursley became angry and threatened to be even with her. The lameness reappeared, and Grace Thurlow was thoroughly convinced that Ursley was to blame. When the case was carried before the justices of the peace, the accused woman denied that she was guilty of anything more than unwitching the afflicted. That she had learned, she said, 10 or more years ago from a woman now deceased. She was committed to the assizes, and Justice Brian Darcy, whose servant Grace Thurlow had started the trouble, took the case in hand. He examined her 8-year-old base son, who gave damning evidence against his mother. She fed 4 imps, Tiffin, Titty, Piggin, and Jacket. The boy's testimony and the judge's promise that if she would confess the truth, she would have favor, seemed to break down the woman's resolution. Bursting out with weeping, she fell upon her knees and confessed that she had 4 spirits. 2 of them she had used for laming, 2 for killing. Not only the details of her son's evidence, but all the earlier charges, she confirmed step by step, first in private confessions to the judge, and then publicly at the court sessions. The woman's stories tallied with those of all her accusers, and displayed no little play of imagination in the orientation of details. Not content with thus entangling herself in a fearful web of crime, she went on to point out other women guilty of similar witchcrafts. 4 of those whom she named were haled before the justice. Elizabeth Bennet, who spun wool for a clothmaker, was one of those most vehemently accused, but she denied knowledge of any kind of witchcraft. It had been charged against her that she kept some wool hidden in a pot under some stones in her house. She denied at first the possession of this potent and malignant charm, but, influenced by the gentle urgings of Justice Darcy, she gave way, as Ursley Kemp had done, and, breaking all restraint, poured forth wild stories of devilish crimes committed through the assistance of her imps. But why should we trace out the confessions, charges, and countercharges that followed? The stories that were poured forth continued to involve a widening group until 16 persons were under accusation of the most awful crimes committed by demoniacal agency. As at Chelmsford, they were the dregs of the lower classes, women with illegitimate children, some of them dependent upon public support. It will be seen that in some respects the panic bore a likeness to those that had preceded. The spirits, which took extraordinary and bizarre forms, were the offspring of the same perverted imaginations, but they had assumed new shapes. Ursley Kemp kept a white lamb, a little gray cat, a black cat, and a black toad. There were spirits of every sort. 2 little things like horses, 1 white, the other black, 6 spirits like cows, as big as rattles, spirits masquerading as blackbirds. 1 spirit, strangely enough, remained invisible. It will be observed by the reader that the spirits almost fitted into a color scheme. Very vivid colors were those preferred in their spirits by these St. Os's women. The reader can see, too, that the confessions showed the influence of the great cat tradition. We have seen the readiness with which the deluded women make confession. Some of the confessions were poured forth as from souls long surcharged with guilt, but not all of them came in this way. Marjorie Salmon, who had testified against one of her neighbors, was finally herself caught in the web of accusation in which a sister had also been involved. She was caused by her sister. "I defy thee," she answered, "though thou art my sister." But her sister drew her aside and whispered her in the ear, after which, with great submission and many tears, she made a voluble confession. One wonders about that whispered consultation. Had her sister perhaps suggested that the justice was offering mercy to those who confessed? For Justice Darcy was very liberal with his promises of mercy and absolutely unscrupulous about breaking them. It is gratifying to be able to record that there was yet a remnant left who confessed nothing at all and stood stubborn to the last. One of them was Margaret Greville, who denied the accusations against her. She saith that she herself hath lost several brewings and bakings of bread, and also swine, but she never did complain thereof, saying that she wished her gear were at a stay, and then she cared not whether she were hanged or burnt or what did become of her. Annis Hurd was another who stuck to her innocence. She could recall various incidents mentioned by her accusers. It was true that she had talked to Andrew West about getting a pig. It was true that she had seen Mr. Harrison at his parsonage gathering plums and had asked for some and been refused. But she denied that she had any imps or that she had killed anyone. The use of evidence in this trial would lead one to suppose that in England no rules of evidence were yet in existence. The testimony of children ranging in age from 6 to 9 was eagerly received. No objection indeed was made to the testimony of a neighbor who professed to have overheard what he deemed an incriminating statement. As a matter of fact, the remark, if made, was harmless enough. Expert evidence was introduced in a roundabout way by the statement offered in court that a physician had suspected that a certain case was witchcraft. Nothing was excluded. The garrulous women had been given free rein to pile up their silly accusations against one another. Not until the trial was nearing its end does it seem to have occurred to Brian Darcy to warn a woman against making false charges. It will be recalled that in the Chelmsford trials Mother Waterhouse had been found to have upon her certain marks, yet little emphasis had been laid upon them. In the trials of 1582 the proof drawn from these marks was deemed of the first importance, and the judge appointed juries of women to make examination. No artist has yet dared to paint the picture of the gloating female inquisitors grouped around their naked and trembling victim, a scene that was to be enacted in many a witch trial. And it is well, for the scene would be too repellent and brutal for reproduction. In the use of these specially instituted juries there was no care to get unbiased decisions. One of the inquisitors appointed to examine Cicely Sells had already served as witness against her. It is hard to refrain from an indictment of the hopelessly prejudiced justice who gathered the evidence. To entrap the defendant seems to have been his end. In the account which he wrote, he seems to have feared lest the public should fail to understand how his cleverness ministered to the conviction of the women. "There is a man," he wrote, "of great cunning and knowledge come over lately unto our Queen's Majesty, which hath advertised her what a company and number of witches be within England. Whereupon I and other of her justices have received commission for the apprehending of as many as are within these limits." No doubt he hoped to attract royal notice and win favor by his zeal. The Chelmsford affairs, and that at St. Asses were the three remarkable trials of their kind in the first part of Elizabeth's reign. They furnish some evidence of the progress of superstition. The procedure in 1582 reveals considerable advance over that of 1566. The theory of diabolic agency had been elaborated. The testimony offered was gaining in complexity and in variety. New proofs of guilt were being introduced, as well as new methods of testing the matter. In the second part of Elizabeth's reign we have but one trial of unusual interest, that at Warboys in Huntingdonshire. This, we shall see, continued the elaboration of the witch procedure. It was a case that attracted probably more notice at the time than any other in the 16th century. The accidental fancy of a child and the pronouncement of a baffled physician were in this instance the originating causes of the trouble. one of the children of Sir Robert Throckmorton, head of a prominent family in Huntingdonshire, was taken ill. It so happened that a neighbor, by name Alice Samuel, called at the house, and the ailing and nervous child took the notion that the woman was a witch and cried out against her. "Did you ever see," said the child, "one more like a witch than she is? Take off her black thrummed cap, for I cannot abide to look on her." Her parents apparently thought nothing of this at the time. When Dr. Barrow, an eminent physician of Cambridge, having treated the child for 2 of the diseases of children, and without success, asked the mother and father if any witchcraft were suspected, he was answered in the negative. The Throckmortons were by no means quick to harbor a suspicion. But when 2 and then 3 other children in the family fell ill and began in the same way to designate Mother Samuel as a witch, the parents were more willing to heed the hint thrown out by the physician. The suspected woman was forcibly brought by Gilbert Pickering, an uncle of the children, into their presence. The children at once fell upon the ground, strangely tormented, and insisted upon scratching Mother Samuel's hand. Meantime, Lady Cromwell visited at the Throckmorton house, and, after an interview with Alice Samuel, suffered in her dreams from her, till at length she fell ill and died, something over a year later. This confirmed what had been suspicion. To detail all the steps taken to prove Mother Samuel guilty is unnecessary. A degree of caution was used which was remarkable. Henry Pickering, a relative, and some of his fellow scholars at Cambridge made an investigation into the case, but decided with the others that the woman was guilty. Mother Samuel herself laid the whole trouble to the children's wantonness. Again and again she was urged by the children to confess. Such were the heavenly and divine speeches of the children in their fits to this old woman, as that if a man had heard it, he would not have thought himself better edified at 10 sermons. The parents pleaded with her to admit her responsibility for the constantly recurring sickness of their children, but she denied bitterly that she was to blame. She was compelled to live at the Throckmorton house and to be a witness constantly to the strange behavior of the children. The poor creature was dragged back and forth, watched and experimented upon in a dozen ways, until it is little wonder that she grew ill and spent her nights in groaning. She was implored to confess and told that all might yet be well. For a long time she persisted in her denial, but at length in a moment of weakness, when the children had come out of their fits at her chance exhortation to them, she became convinced that she was guilty and exclaimed, "Oh, sir, I have been the cause of all this trouble to your children." The woman, who up to this time had shown some spirit, had broken down. She now confessed that she had given her soul to the devil. A clergyman was hastily sent for, who preached a sermon of repentance, upon which the distracted woman made a public confession. But on the next day, after she had been refreshed by sleep and had been in her own home again, she denied her confession. The constable now prepared to take the woman as well as her daughter to the Bishop of Lincoln, and the frightened creature again made a confession. In the presence of the bishop, she reiterated her story in detail and gave the names of her spirits. She was put in jail at Huntingdon, and with her were imprisoned her daughter Agnes and her husband John Samuel, who were now accused by the Throckmorton children, and all 3 were tried at the assizes in Huntingdon before Judge Fenner. The facts already narrated were given in evidence. The seizures of the children at the appearance of any of the Samuel family, the certainty with which the children could with closed eyes pick Mother Samuel out of a crowd and scratch her, the confessions of the crazed creature, all these evidences were given to the court. But the strongest proof was that given in the presence of the court. The daughter Agnes Samuel was charged to repeat, "As I am a witch in consenting to the death of Lady Cromwell, I charge thee, come out of her." At this charge, the children would at once recover from their fits. But a charge phrased negatively, "As I am no witch," was ineffectual, and the affirmative charge, when tried by some other person, had no result. This was deemed conclusive proof. The woman was beyond doubt guilty. The same method was applied with equally successful issue to the father. When he refused to use the words of the charge, he was warned by the judge that he would endanger his life. He gave way. It is needless to say that the grand jury arraigned all three of the family, and that the jury of life and death found them guilty. It needed but a 5 hours trial. The mother was induced to plead pregnancy as a delay to execution, but after an examination by a jury was adjudged not pregnant. The daughter had been urged to make the same defense, but spiritedly replied, "It shall never be said that I was both a witch and a whore." At the execution, the mother made another confession, in which she implicated her husband, but refused to the end to accuse her daughter. From beginning to end, it had been the strong against the weak. Sir Robert Throckmorton, Sir Henry Cromwell, William Wickham, Bishop of Lincoln, the Justices of the Peace, Justice Fenner of the King's Court, the Cambridge Scholars, the Doctor of Divinity, and 2 other clergymen, all were banded together against this poor but respectable family. In some respects, the trial reminds us of one that was to take place 99 years later in Massachusetts. The part played by the children in the 2 instances was very similar. Mother Samuel had hit the nail on the head when she said that the trouble was due to the children's wantonness. Probably the first child had really suffered from some slight ailment. The others were imitators eager to gain notice and pleased with their success. And this fact was realized by some people at the time. It had been reported by some in the county, those that thought themselves wise, that this Mother Samuel was an old, simple woman, and that one might make her by fair words confess what they would. Moreover, the tone of the writer's defense makes it evident that others beside Mother Samuel laid the action of the Throckmorton children to wantonness. And 6 years later, Samuel Harsnet, chaplain to the Bishop of London and a man already influential, called the account of the affair a very ridiculous book, and evidently believed the children guilty of the same pretenses as William Summers, whose confessions of imposture he was relating. We have already observed that the Warboys affair was the only celebrated trial of its sort in the last part of Elizabeth's reign, that is, from the time of Reginald Scott to the accession of James I. This does not mean that the superstition was waning or that the trials were on the decrease. The records show that the number of trials was steadily increasing. They were more widely distributed. London was still the center of the belief. Chief Justice Anderson sent Joan Kirk to Tyburn, and the Middlesex sessions were still occupied with accusations. The counties adjacent to it could still claim more than 2/3 of the executions, but a far wider area was infected with the superstition. Norfolk and East Anglia, Leicester, Nottingham and Derby in the Midlands, and York and Northumberland in the north were all involved. The truth is that there are 2 tendencies that appear very clearly towards the last part of Elizabeth's reign. On the one hand, the feeling of the people against witchcraft was growing in intensity, while on the other, the administration at London was inclined to be more lenient. Pardons and reprieves were issued to women already condemned, while some attempt was made to curb popular excitement. The attitude of the Queen towards the celebrated John Dee was an instance in point. Dee was an eminent alchemist, astrologer, and spiritualist of his time. He has left a diary which shows us his half-mystic, half-scientific pursuits. In the earlier part of Mary's reign, he had been accused of attempting poison or magic against the Queen and had been imprisoned and examined by the Privy Council and by the Star Chamber. At Elizabeth's accession, he had cast the horoscope for her coronation day. and he was said to have revealed to the queen who were her enemies at foreign courts. More than once afterwards, Dee was called upon by the queen to render her services when she was ill or when some mysterious design against her person was feared. While he dealt with many curious things, he had consistently refused to meddle with conjuring. Indeed, he had rebuked the conjurer Hartley and had refused to help the bewitched Margaret Byram of Cleworth in Lancashire, sometime about 1590. Dee's enemies, and he had many, put in circulation stories of his success as a conjurer. It was the more easy to do, because for a long time he had been suspected by many of unlawful dealings with spirits. His position became dangerous. He appealed to Elizabeth for protection, and she gave him assurance that he might push on with his studies. Throughout her life, the Queen continued to stand by Dee, and it was not until a new sovereign came to the throne that he again came into danger. But the moral of the incident is obvious. The Privy Council, so nervous about the conjurers in the days of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Catholic and Spanish plots, was now resting easier and refused to be affrighted. We have already referred to the pardons issued as one of the evidences of the more lenient policy of the government. That policy appeared, too, in the lessening rigor of the assize judges. The first half of Elizabeth's reign had been marked by few acquittals. Nearly half the cases of which we have record in the second part resulted in the discharge of the accused. Whether the judges were taking their cue from the Privy Council, or whether some of them were feeling the same reaction against the cruelty of the prosecutions, it is certain that there was a considerable nullifying of the force of the belief. We shall see in the chapter on Reginald Scott that his discovery of witchcraft was said to have affected the magistracy and the clergy. It is hard to lay one's finger upon influences of this sort, but we can hardly doubt that there was some connection between Scott's brave indictment of the witch triers and the lessening severity of court verdicts. When George Gifford, the nonconformist clergyman at Maiden, wrote his dialogue concerning witches, in which he earnestly deprecated the conviction of so many witches, he dedicated the book to the right worshipful Maester Robert Clark, one of Her Majesty's barons of Her Highness Court of the Exchequer, and wrote that he had been delighted to hear and see the wise and godly course used upon the seat of justice by your worship, when such have been arraigned. Unfortunately, there is not much evidence of this kind. One other fact must not be overlooked. A large percentage of the cases that went against the accused were in towns judicially independent of the assize courts. At Faversham, at Lynn, at Yarmouth, and at Leicester, the local municipal authorities were to blame for the hanging of witches. The regular assize courts had nothing to do with the matter. The case at Faversham in Kent was unusual. Joan Casson was indicted for bewitching to death a 3-year-old child. 8 of her neighbors, 7 of them women, poor people, testified against her. The woman took up her own cause with great spirit and exposed the malicious dealings of her adversaries, and also certain controversies betwixt her and them. But although she satisfied the bench, says Holinshed, and all the jury touching her innocency, she confessed that a little vermin, being of color reddish, of stature less than a rat, did haunt her house. She was willing, too, to admit illicit relations with one mason, whose housekeeper she had been, probably the original cause of her troubles. The jury acquitted her of witchcraft, but found her guilty of the invocation of evil spirits, intending to send her to the pillory. While the mayor was admonishing her, a lawyer called attention to the point that the invocation of evil spirits had been made a felony. The mayor sentenced the woman to execution, but because there was no matter of invocation given in evidence against her execution was stayed by the space of 3 days. Sundry preachers tried to wring confessions from her, but to no purpose. Yet she made so godly an end, says the chronicler, that Monnier now lamented her death, which were before here utter enemies. The case illustrates vividly the clumsiness of municipal court procedure. The mayor's court was unfamiliar with the law and utterly unable to avert the consequences of its own finding. In the regular assize courts, Joan Kaysen would probably have been sentenced to 4 public appearances in the pillory. The differences between the first half and the second half of Elizabeth's reign have not been deemed wide enough by the writer to justify separate treatment. The whole reign was a time when the superstition was gaining ground. Yet in the span of years from Reginald Scot to the death of Elizabeth, there was enough of reaction to justify a differentiation of statistics. In both periods, and more particularly in the first, we may be sure that some of the records have been lost, and that a thorough search of local archives would reveal some trials of which we have at present no knowledge. It was a time rich in mention of witch trials, but a time, too, when but few cases were fully described. Scott's incidental references to the varied experiences of Sir Roger Manwood and of his uncle Sir Thomas Scott merely confirm an impression gained from the literature of the time that the witch executions were becoming, throughout the 70s and early 80s, too common to be remarkable. For the second period, we have record of probably a larger percentage of all the cases. For the whole time from 1563, when the new law went into effect, down to 1603, we have records of nearly 50 executions. Of these, just about 2/3 occurred in the earlier period, while of the acquittals 2/3 belong to the later period. It would be rash to attach too much significance to these figures. As a matter of fact, the records are so incomplete that the actual totals have little, if any, meaning, and only the proportions can be considered. Yet it looks as if the forces which caused the persecution of witches in England were beginning to abate, and it may fairly be inquired whether some new factor may not have entered into the situation. It is time to speak of Reginald Scot and of the exorcists. From the chronicling of witch trials, we turn aside in this chapter to follow the career of the first great English opponent of the superstition. We have seen how the attack upon the supposed creatures of the devil was growing stronger throughout the reign of Elizabeth. We shall see how that attack was checked, at least in some degree, by the resistance of one man. Few men of so quiet and studious life have wrought so effectively as Reginald Scot. He came of a family well known in Kent, but not politically aggressive. As a young man, he studied at Hart Hall in Oxford, but left without taking his degree and returned to Scots Hall, where he settled down to the routine duties of managing his estate. He gave himself over, we are told, to husbandry and gardening, and to a solid course of general reading in the obscure authors that had, by the generality, been neglected. In 1574, his studies in horticulture resulted in the publication of a perfect platform of a hop garden and necessary instructions for the making and maintaining thereof. That the book ministered to a practical interest was evidenced by the call for 3 editions within 5 years. Whether he now applied himself to the study of that subject, which was to be the theme of his discovery, we do not know. It was a matter which had doubtless arrested his attention even earlier, and had enlisted a growing interest upon his part. Not until a decade after his hop garden, however, did he put forth the epoch-making discovery. Nor does it seem likely that he had been engaged for a long period on the actual composition. Rather, the style and matter of the book seem to evince traces of hurry in preparation. If this theory be true, and Mr. Brinsley Nicholson, his modern commentator, has adduced excellent reasons for accepting it, there can be but one explanation: the St. Os's affair, that tragedy, occurring within a short distance of his own home, had no doubt so outraged his sense of justice that the work which he had perhaps long been contemplating he now set himself to complete as soon as possible. Even he who runs may read in Scott's strong sentences that he was not writing for instruction only, to propound a new doctrine, but that he was battling with a single purpose to stop a detestable and wicked practice. Something of a dilettante in real life, he became in his writing a man with an absorbing mission. That mission sprang not indeed from indignation at the St. Os's affair alone. From the days of childhood, his experience had been of a kind to encourage skepticism. He had been reared in a county where Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, first came into prominence, and he had seen the downfall that followed her public exposure. In the year after he brought out his Hoppegarden, his county was again stirred by performances of a supposedly supernatural character. Mildred Norrington, a girl of 17, used ventriloquism with such skill that she convinced 2 clergymen and all her neighbors that she was possessed. In answer to queries, the evil spirit that spoke through Mildred declared that old Alice of Westwell had sent him to possess the girl. Alice, the spirit admitted, stood guilty of terrible witchcrafts. The demon's word was taken, and Alice seems to have been arraigned upon this evidence. But, through the justice's adroit management of the trial, the fraud of the accuser was exposed. She confessed herself a pretender and suffered condign punishment. This case happened within 6 miles of Scott's home and opened his eyes to the possibility of humbug. In the very same year, 2 pretenders, Agnes Bridges and Rachel Pinder, were convicted in London. By vomiting pins and straws, they had convinced many that they were bewitched, but the trickery was soon found out, and they were compelled to do public penance at St. Paul's. We are not told what was the fate of a detestable Mother Baker, who, when consulted by the parents of a sick girl at New Romney in Kent, accused a neighbor woman. She said that the woman had made a waxen heart and pricked it, and by this means accomplished her evil purpose. In order to prove her accusation, she had in the meantime concealed the wax figure of a heart in the house of the woman she accused, and then pretended to find it. It is some satisfaction to know that the malicious creature, who, during the history of witchcraft, had many imitators, was caught and compelled to confess. Scott learned, indeed, by observing marvels of this sort, what it is strange that many others did not learn, to look upon displays of the supernatural with a good deal of doubt. How much he had ever believed in them we do not know. It is not unlikely that in common with his generation he had, as a young man, held a somewhat ill-defined opinion about the devil's use of witches. The belief in that had come down, a comparatively innocuous tradition, from a primitive period. It was a subject that had not been raised in speculation, or for that matter in courtrooms. But since Scott's early manhood, all this had been changed. England had been swept by a tidal wave of suspicion. Hazy theological notions had been tightened into rigid convictions. Convictions had passed into legislative statutes and instructions to judges. The bench, which had at first acted on the new laws with caution and a desire to detect imposture, became infected with a fear and grew more ready to discover witchcraft and to punish it. It is unnecessary to recapitulate the progress of a movement already traced in the previous chapter. Suffice it to say that the Kentish gentleman, familiarized with accounts of imposture, was unwilling to follow the rising current of superstition. Of course, this is merely another way of saying that Scott was unconventional in his mental operations and thought the subject out for himself with results variant from those of his own generation. Here was a new abuse in England. Here was a wrong that he had seen spring up within his own lifetime and in his own part of England. He made it his mission, as far as possible, to right the wrong. For so much, he says, as the mighty help themselves together, and the poor widow's cree, though it reach to heaven, is scarce heard here upon earth. I thought good, according to my poor ability, to make intercession, that some part of common rigor, and some points of hasty judgment may be advised upon. It was indeed a splendid mission, and he was singularly well equipped for it. He had the qualifications, scholarly training, and the power of scientific observation, a background of broad theological and scriptural information, a familiarity with legal learning and practice, as well as a command of vigorous and incisive language, which were certain to make his work effective towards its object. That he was a scholar is true in more senses than one. In his use of deduction from classical writers, he was something of a scholastic. In his willingness to venture into new fields of thought, he was a product of the Renaissance. In his thorough use of research, he reminds us of a modern investigator. He gives in his book a bibliography of the works consulted by him, and one counts over 200 Latin and 30 English titles. His reading had covered the whole field of superstition. To Cornelius Agrippa and to Wierus, Johann Weyer, who had attacked the tyranny of superstition upon the continent, he owed an especial debt. He had not, however, borrowed enough from them to impair in any serious way the value of his own original contribution. In respect to law, Scott was less a student than a man of experience. The discovery, however, bristled with references which indicated a legal way of thinking. He was almost certainly a man who had used the law. Brinsley Nicholson believes that he had been a justice of the peace. In any case, he had a lawyer's sense of the value of evidence and a lawyer's way of putting his case. No less practical was his knowledge of theology and scripture. Here he had to meet the baffling problems of the Witch of Endor. The story of the witch who had called up before the frightened king saw the spirit of the dead Samuel and made him speak, stood as a lion in the path of all opponents of witch persecution. When Scott dared to explain this Old Testament tale as an instance of ventriloquism and to compare it to the celebrated case of Mildred Norrington, he showed a boldness in interpretation of the Bible far in advance of his contemporaries. His anticipation of present-day points of view cropped out, perhaps more in his scientific spirit than in any other way. 4 years before he put pen to paper, he had been conducting investigations into alleged cases of conjuring and witchcraft, attending trials, and questioning clergymen and magistrates. For such observation, he was most favorably situated, and he used his position in his community to further his knowledge. A man almost impertinently curious was this 16th century student. When he learned of a conjurer whose sentence of death had been remitted by the Queen and who professed penitence for his crimes, he opened a correspondence and obtained from the man the clear statement that his conjuries were all impostures. The prisoner referred him to a book written in the old Saxon tongue by one Sir John Malborn, a divine of Oxenford, 300 years past, in which all these trickeries are cleared up. Scott put forth his best efforts to procure the work from the parson to whom it had been entrusted, but without success. In another case, he attended the assizes at Rochester, where a woman was on trial. One of her accusers was the vicar of the parish, who made several charges, not the least of which was that he could not enunciate clearly in church owing to enchantment. This explanation Scott carried to her, and she was able to give him an explanation much less creditable to the clergyman of the ailment, an explanation which Scott found confirmed by an inquiry among the neighbors. To quiet such rumors in the community about the nature of the illness, the vicar had to procure from London a medical certificate that it was a lung trouble. Can we wonder that a student at such pains to discover the fact as to a wrong done should have used barbed words in the portrayal of injustice? Strong convictions spurred on his pen, already taught to shape vigorous and incisive sentences. Not a stylist, as measured by the highest Elizabethan standards of charm and mellifluence. He possessed a clearness and directness which won the modern reader. By his methods of analysis, he displayed a quality of mind akin to, and probably influenced by that of Calvin, while his intellectual attitude showed the stimulus of the Reformation. He was indeed, in his own restricted field, a reformer. He was not only the protagonist of a new cause, but a pioneer who had to cut through the underbrush of opinion a pathway for speculation to follow. So far as England was concerned, Scott found no philosophy of the subject, no systematic defenses or assaults upon the loosely constructed theory of demonic agency. It was for him to state in definite terms the beliefs he was seeking to overthrow. The Roman Church knew fairly well by this time what it meant by witchcraft, but English theologians and philosophers would hardly have found common ground on any one tenet about the matter. Without exaggeration, it may be asserted that Scott, by his assault all along the front, forced the enemy's advance, and in some sense dictated his line of battle. The assault was directed indeed against the center of the opposing entrenchments, the belief in the continuance of miracles. Scott declared that with Christ and his apostles the age of miracles had passed, an opinion which he supported by the authority of Calvin and of St. Augustine. What was counted the supernatural assumed two forms: the phenomena exhibited by those whom he classed under the wide term of cozeners, and the phenomena said to be exhibited by the poor, doting women, known as witches. The tricks and deceits of the cozeners he was at great pains to explain. Not less than 1/3 of his work is given up to setting forth the methods of conjurers, card tricks, sleight of hand performances, illusions of magic, materializations of spirits, and the wonders of alchemy and astrology. In the range of his information about these subjects, the discoverer was encyclopedic. No current form of dabbling with the supernatural was left unexposed. In his attack upon the phenomena of witchcraft, he had a different problem. He had to deal with phenomena, the so-called facts of which were not susceptible of any material explanation. The theory of a devil who had intimate relations with human beings, who controlled them and sent them out upon maleficent errands, was in its essence a theological conception and could not be absolutely disproved by scientific observation. It was necessary instead to attack the idea on its a priori grounds. This attack Scott attempted to base on the nature of spirits. Spirits and bodies, he urged, are antithetical and inconvertible, nor can anyone save God give spirit a bodily form. The devil, a something beyond our comprehension, cannot change spirit in a body, nor can he himself assume a bodily form, nor has he any power save that granted him by God for vengeance. This being true, the whole belief in the devil's intercourse with witches is undermined. Such, very briefly, were the philosophic bases of Scott's skepticism. Yet the more cogent parts of his work were those in which he denied the validity of any evidence so far offered for the existence of witches. "What is witchcraft?" he asked, and his answer is worth quoting. "Witchcraft is in truth a cozening art, wherein the name of God is abused, profaned, and blasphemed, and his power attributed to a vile creature. In estimation of the vulgar people, it is a supernatural work, contrived between a corporal old woman and a spiritual devil. The manner thereof is so secret, mystical, and strange, that to this day there hath never been any credible witness thereof." The want of credible evidence was indeed a point upon which Scott continually insisted with great force. He pictured vividly the course which a witchcraft case often ran. One sort of such as are said to be witches are women which be commonly old, lame, bleary-eyed, pale, foul, and full of wrinkles. They are lean and deformed, shewing melancholy in their faces. They are doting, scolds, mad, devilish. These miserable wretches are so odious unto all their neighbors, and so feared, as few dare offend them, or deny them anything they ask, whereby they take upon them, yea, and sometimes think that they can do such things as are beyond the ability of humane nature. These go from house to house, and from door to door for a pot of milk, yes, drink, pottage, or some such relief, without the which they could hardly live. It falleth out many times, that neither their necessities nor their expectation is answered. In tract of time the which waxeth odious and tedious to hear neighbors. She curseth one, and sometimes another, and that from the master of the house, his wife, children, cattle, etc., to the little pig that leeth in the sty. Doubtless, at length, some of her neighbors die, or fall sick. Then they suspect her, says Scott, and grow convinced that she is the author of their mishaps. The witch, seeing things sometimes come to pass, according to her wishes, being called before a justice, confesseth that she hath brought such things to pass, wherein not one lies she, but the accuser, and also the justice are foully deceived and abused. Such indeed was the epitome of many cases. The process from beginning to end was never better described. The ease with which confessions were dragged from weak-spirited women was never pictured more truly. With quite as keen insight, he displayed the motives that animated witnesses and described the prejudices and fears that worked on jurors and judges. It was, indeed, upon these factors that he rested the weight of his argument for the negative. The affirmative opinion was grounded, he believed, upon the ignorance of the common people, assotted and bewitched by the jesting or serious words of poets, by the inventions of lowed liars and cozeners, and by tales they have heard from old doting women, or from their mothers' maids, and with whatsoever the grandful their ghostly father, or any other moro-mass priest had informed them. By the same method by which he opposed the belief in witchcraft, he opposed the belief in possession by an evil spirit. The known cases, when examined, proved frauds. The instances in the New Testament he seemed inclined to explain by the assumption that possession merely meant disease. That Scott should maintain an absolute negative in the face of all strange phenomena would have been too much to expect. He seems to have believed, though not without some difficulty, that stones had in them certain proper virtues which are given them of a special influence of the planets. The unicorn's horn, he thought, had certain curative properties, and he had heard, by credible report, and the affirmation of many grave authors, that the wound of a man murdered reneweth bleeding at the presence of a dear friend, or of a mortal enemy. His credulity in these points may be disappointing to the reader who hopes to find in Scott a scientific rationalist. That, of course, he was not, and his leaning towards superstition on these points makes one ask, what did he really believe about witchcraft? When all the fraud and false testimony and self-deception were excluded, what about the remaining cases of witchcraft? Scott was very careful never to deny in toto the existence of witches. That would have been to deny the Bible. What were these witches, then? Doubtless he would have answered that he had already classified them under two heads. They were either cozeners or poor doting women, and by cozeners he seems to have meant those who used trickery and fraud. In other words, Scott distinctly implied that there were no real witches, with powers given them by the devil. Would he have stood by this when pushed into a corner? It is just possible that he would have done so, that he understood his own implications, but hardly dared to utter a straightforward denial of the reality of witchcraft. It is more likely that he had not altogether thought himself out. The immediate impression of Scott's book we know little about. Such contemporary comment as we have is neutral. That his book was read painstakingly by every later writer on the subject, that it shortly became the great support of one party in the controversy, that King James deemed it worthwhile to write an answer, and that on his accession to the throne he almost certainly ordered the book to be burned by the common hangman. These are better evidence than absolutely contemporary notices to show that the discovery exerted an influence. And so the story continues, as we move now to village accusations and country trials. We cannot better suggest how radical Scott's position must have seemed to his own time than by showing the point of view of another opponent of witchcraft, George Gifford, a nonconformist clergyman. He had read the discovery and probably felt that the theological aspect of the subject had been neglected. Moreover, it had probably been his fortune, as Scott's, to attend the St. Os's trials. 3 years after Scott's book, he brought out a discourse of the subtle practices of devils by witches, and followed it 6 years later by a dialogue concerning witches, a book in which he expounded his opinions in somewhat more popular fashion. Like Scott, he wrote to end, so far as possible, the punishment of innocent women. Like Scott, he believed that most of the evidence presented against them was worthless, but on other points he was far less radical. There were witches. He found them in the Bible. To be sure, they were nothing more than pawns for the devil. He uses them only for a color, that is, puts them forward to cover his own dealings, and then he deludes them and makes them believe things which are nothing so. In consequence, they frequently, at their executions, falsely accuse others of dreadful witchcrafts. It is all the work of the devil. But he himself cannot do anything except through the power of God, who, sometimes for vengeance upon his enemies, and sometimes to try his own people, permits the evil one to do harm. Gifford, of course, never made the impression that Scott had made. But he represented the more conservative position and was the first in a long line of writers who deprecated persecution while they accepted the current view as to witchcraft, and therefore he furnishes a standard by which to measure Scott, who had nothing of the conservative about him. Scott had many readers and exerted a strong influence even upon those who disagreed with him, but he had few or none to follow in his steps. It was not until nearly a century later that there came upon the scene a man who dared to speak as Scott had spoken. Few men have been so far ahead of their time. In the narrative of English witchcraft, the story of the exorcists is a side issue. Yet their performances were so closely connected with the operations of the devil and of his agents that they cannot be left out of account in any adequate statement of the subject. And it is impossible to understand the strength and weakness of a superstition without a comprehension of the role that the would-be agents for expelling evil spirits played. That the rain which had seen pass in procession the bands of conjurers and witches should close with the exorcists was to be expected. It was their part to complete the cycle of superstition. If miracles of magic were possible, if conjurers could use a supernatural power of some sort to assist them in performing wonders, there was nothing very remarkable about creatures who wrought harm to their fellows through the agency of evil spirits. And if witches could send evil spirits to do harm, it followed that those spirits could be expelled or exorcised by divine assistance. If by prayer to the devil demons could be commanded to enter human beings, they could be driven out by prayer to God. The processes of reasoning were perfectly clear, and they were easily accepted because they found adequate confirmation in the New Testament. The Gospels were full of narratives of men possessed with evil spirits who had been freed by the invocation of God. Of these stories, no doubt the most quoted, and the one most effective in molding opinion, was the account of the dispossessed devils who had entered into a herd of swine and plunged over a steep place into the sea. It must not be supposed that exorcism was a result of belief in witchcraft. It was as old as the Christian Church. It was still made use of by the Roman Church and, indeed, by certain Protestant groups. And just at this time, the Roman Church found it a most important instrument in the struggle against the Reformed religions. In England, Romanism was waging a losing war and had need of all the miracles that it could claim in order to re-establish its waning credit. The hunted priests who were being driven out by Whitgift were not unwilling to resort to a practice which they hoped would regain for them the allegiance of the common people. During the years 1585 to 1586, they had conducted what they considered marvelous works of exorcism in Catholic households of Buckinghamshire and Middlesex. Great efforts have been made to keep news of these seances from reaching the ears of the government, but accounts of them had gained wide circulation and came to the Privy Council. That body was, of course, stimulated to greater activity against the Catholics. As a phase of suppressed form of religion, the matter might never have assumed any significance. Had not a third-rate Puritan clergyman, John Darrell, almost by accident hit upon the use of exorcism, the story of its use would be hardly worth telling. When this young minister was not more than 20, but already, as he says, reckoned a man of hope, he was asked to cure a 17-year-old girl at Mansfield in Nottingham, Catherine Wright. Her disease called for simple medical treatment. That was not Darrell's plan of operation. She had an evil spirit, he declared. From 4 o'clock in the morning until noon, he prayed over her spirit. He either set going of his own initiative the opinion that possessed persons could point out witches, or he quickly availed himself of such a belief already existing. The evil spirit, he declared, could recognize and even name the witch that had sent it, as well as the witch's confederates. All of this was no doubt suggested to the possessed girl, and she was soon induced to name the witch that troubled her. This was Margaret Roper, a woman with whom she was upon bad terms. Margaret Roper was at once taken into custody by the constable. She happened to be brought before a justice of the peace possessing more than usual discrimination. He not only discharged her, but threatened John Darrell with arrest. This was in 1586. Darrell disappeared from view for 10 years or so, when he turned up at Burton-upon-Trent, not very far from the scene of his first operations. Here he volunteered to cure Thomas Darling. The story is a curious one and too long for repetition. Some facts must, however, be presented in order to bring the story up to the point at which Darrell intervened. Thomas Darling, a young Derbyshire boy, had become ill after returning from a hunt. He was afflicted with innumerable fits, in which he saw green angels and a green cat. His aunt very properly consulted a physician, who at the second consultation thought it possible that the child was bewitched. The aunt failed to credit the diagnosis. The boy's fits continued and soon took on a religious character. Between seizures, he conversed with godly people. They soon discovered that the reading of the scriptures brought on attacks. This looked very like the devil's work. The suggestion of the physician was more seriously regarded. Meanwhile, the boy had overheard the discussion of witchcraft and proceeded to relate a story. He had met, he said, a little old woman in a gray gown with a black fringe about the cape, a broad trimmed hat, and 3 warts on her face. Very accidentally, as he claimed, he offended her. She angrily said a rhyming charm that ended with the words, "I will go to heaven, and thou shalt go to hell," and stooped to the ground. The story produced a sensation. Those who heard it declared at once that the woman must have been Elizabeth Wright, or her daughter Alce Goodridge, women long suspected of witchcraft. Alce was fetched to the boy. She said she had never seen him, but her presence increased the violence of his fits. Mother and daughter were carried before 2 justices of the peace, who examined them together with Alce's husband and daughter. The women were searched for special marks in the usual revolting manner with the usual outcome, but only Alice herself was sent to jail. The boy grew no better. It was discovered that the reading of certain verses in the first chapter of John invariably set him off. The justices of the peace put Alice through several examinations, but with little result. 2 good witches were consulted, but refused to help unless the family of the bewitched came to see them. Meantime, a cunning man appeared who promised to prove Alice a witch. In the presence of Manier worshipful personages, he put a pair of new shoes on her feet, setting her close to the fire till the shoes, being extreme hot, might constrain her through increase of the pain to confess. This, says the writer, was his ridiculous practice. The woman, being thoroughly heated, desired a release and offered to confess, but, as soon as her feet were cooled, refused. No doubt the justices of the peace would have repudiated the statement that the illegal process of torture was used. The methods of the cunning man were really nothing else. The woman was harried day and night by neighbors to bring her to confess. At length she gave way and, in a series of reluctant confessions, told a crude story of her wrongdoings that bore some slight resemblance to the boy's tale, and involved the use of a spirit in the form of a dog. Now it was that John Darrell came upon the ground, eager to make a name for himself. Darling had been ill for 3 months and was not improving. Even yet, some of the boy's relatives and friends doubted if he were possessed. Not so Darrell. He at once undertook to pray and fast for the boy. According to his own account, his efforts were singularly blessed. At all events, the boy gradually improved, and Darrell claimed the credit. As for Alice Goodridge, she was tried at the assizes, convicted by the jury, and sentenced by Lord Chief Justice Anderson to imprisonment. She died soon after. This affair undoubtedly widened Darrell's reputation. Not long after, a notable case of possession in Lancashire afforded him a new opportunity to attract notice. The case of Nicholas Starchy's children provoked so much comment at the time that it is perhaps worthwhile to go back and bring the narrative up to the point where Darrell entered. 2 of Starchy's children had one day been taken ill most mysteriously, the girl with a dumpish and heave-eye countenance, and with a certain fearful starting and pulling together of her body. The boy was compelled to shout on the way to school. Both grew steadily worse, and the father consulted Edmund Hartley, a noted conjurer of his time. Hartley quieted the children by the use of charms. When he realized that his services would be indispensable to the father, he made a pretense of leaving, and so forced a promise from Starchy to pay him 40 shillings a year. This ruse was so successful that he raised his demands. He asked for a house and lot, but was refused. The children fell ill again. The perplexed parent now went to a physician of Manchester, but the physician saw in no sign of sickness. Dr. D., the famous astrologer and friend of Elizabeth, was summoned. He advised the help of God-lie preachers. Meantime, the situation in the afflicted family took a more serious turn. Besides Mr. Starchy's children, 3 young wards of his, a servant, and a visitor were all taken with a mysterious illness. The modern reader might suspect that some contagious disease had gripped the family, but the irregular and intermittent character of the disease precludes a hypothesis. Darrell, in his own pamphlet on the matter, declares that when the parents on one occasion went to a play, the children were quiet, but that when they were engaged in godly exercise they were tormented, a statement that raises a suspicion that the disease, like that of the Throckmorton children, was largely imaginary. But the divines were at work. They had questioned the conjurer, and had found that he fumbled very ill-favoredly in the repetition of the Lord's Prayer. He was haled before a justice of the peace, who began gathering evidence against him and turned him over to the assizes. There it came out that he had been wont to kiss the starchy children, and had even attempted, although without success, to kiss a maid servant. In this way, he had presumably communicated the evil spirit a new notion. The court could find no law, however, upon which to hang him. He had bewitched the children, but he had bewitched none of them to death, and therefore had not incurred the death penalty. But the father leaped into the gap. He remembered that he had seen the conjurer draw a magic circle and divide it into 4 parts, and that he had bidden the witness step into the quarters one after another. Making such circles was definitely mentioned in the law as felony. Hartley denied the charge, but to no purpose. He was convicted of felony, so far as we can judge, on this unsupported afterthought of a single witness, and was hanged. Sympathy, however, would be inappropriate. In the whole history of witchcraft, there were few victims who came so near to deserving their fate. This was the story up to the time of Daryl's arrival. With Daryl came his assistant, George Moore, pastor of a church in Derbyshire. The two at once recognized the supernatural character of the case they were to treat and began religious services for the stricken family. It was to no effect. All or most of them joined together in a strange and supernatural loud whooping that the house and ground did sound therewith again. But the exorcists were not by any means disheartened. On the following day, in company with another minister, they renewed the services and were able to expel 6 of the 7 spirits. On the 3rd day, they stormed and took the last citadel of Satan. Unhappily, the capture was not permanent. Daryl tells us himself that the woman later became a papist, and the evil spirit returned. The exorcist now turned his skill upon a young apprentice musician of Nottingham. According to Daryl's story of the affair, William Summers had 9 years before met an old woman who had threatened him. Again, more than a year before Daryl came to Nottingham, Summers had had 2 encounters with a strange woman at a deep coal pit, hard by the wayside. Soon afterwards he did use such straying and idle kind of gestures and laughing, dancing and such like light behavior, that he was suspected to be mad. He began to suffer from bodily distortions, and to evince other signs of possession which created no little excitement in Nottingham. Daryl had been sent for by this time. He came at once, and with his usual precipitancy pronounced the case one of possession. Summers, he said, was suffering for the sins of Nottingham. It was time that something should be done. Prayer and fasting were instituted. For 3 days the youth was preached to and prayed over, while the people of Nottingham, or some of them at least, joined in the fast. On the 3rd day came what was deemed a most remarkable exhibition. The preacher named slowly, one after another, 14 signs of possession. As he named them, Summers illustrated in turn each form of possession. Here was confirmatory evidence of a high order. The exorcist had outdone himself. He now held out promises of deliverance for the subject. For a quarter of an hour the boy lay as if dead, and then rose up quite well. Daryl now took up again the witchfinder's role he had once before assumed. Summers was encouraged to name the contrivers of his bewitchment. Through him, Daryl is said to have boasted, they would expose all the witches in England. They made a most excellent start at it. 13 women were accused by the boy, who would fall into fits at the sight of a witch, and a general invitation was extended to prefer charges. But the community was becoming a bit incredulous and failed to respond. All but 2 of the accused women were released.